Thank you for the opportunity to present our article at this conference.
The title of our article is Relational Welfare in Student Life, exploring narratives of belonging, exclusion, and mental health.
As many of you know, student mental health in higher education is a really growing concern.
Yes, and traditionally we've often looked at it through a very individual lens, focusing on individual factors.
Right, but there's this increasing awareness now, isn't there, about the role social connections play?
Absolutely. The university environment itself, the social fabric, it significantly shapes how students are actually doing.
And that leads to this shift, understanding well-being as something, well, relational, built through connection.
Feeling recognized, included, that sense of belonging.
Which raises really interesting questions. How can universities actively create supportive spaces, going beyond just the traditional counseling services?
Exactly. And our article really dives into this. We examine student narratives, their own stories about well-being and belonging throughout their university life.
We wanted to understand how these feelings of inclusion or exclusion develop, not just at the start, but over time.
Through everyday interactions, yes, and also the wider institutional context, the university culture.
So, to frame this, we drew on relational welfare theory. Sarah White's work is key here, and also the concept of mattering,
which people like Prolotensky and Flatt have explored. It's about how these dynamics are felt, how they're signaled, how they're responded to, or not, within the university setting.
We also brought in ideas from complexity theory, thinking of the university as, a complex system.
So for our methodology, the analysis is based on 470 student-written narratives. Personal stories.
These were collected using the SenseMaker platform between October 2020 and October 2023.
We put out an invitation asking students aged 18 and over to share personal stories about university experiences that significantly affected their well-being.
We actually started with, I think it was 604 narratives.
That's right. And we then selected the 470 that really focus on interpersonal relationships and social experiences at uni.
And the participants, a real mix. Undergraduates, postgraduates.
Different ages, different fields of study. Demographically, about 2/3 identified as women, 1/3 as men.
And importantly, ethical approval was granted for the study.
Yes. And while we did revisit some data from a previous study that one focused more on early social inclusion, the analysis here is new.
Right. This time we were looking much more broadly at well-being across time, and specifically at these relational and institutional dynamics.
For the analysis itself, we used reflexive thematic analysis,
which is essentially a way of carefully reading the narratives, identifying patterns inductively,
letting the themes emerge from the data itself through a lot of iteration and discussion.
Guided, as you said, by relational welfare, mattering, and complexity perspectives.
And we were really zeroing in on those experiences that students described as having a lasting emotional or, existential impact.
And exploring how those reflected the broader relational and systemic conditions at the university.
Okay, so let's get into the findings. One of the first big themes that jumped out was the power of what we termed small signs of mattering.
These were, seemingly quite modest social gestures, small things.
But they had a really significant emotional impact. They really built that sense of recognition, of belonging, of mattering.
They weren't grand events, just everyday things that basically signaled you're seen.
You're part of this, which connects directly to that idea of mattering, feeling valued, and feeling like you add value too.
We had one student share a really powerful example. Do you remember the one about the grocery trip?
Oh, yes. They said, I remember so clearly when last autumn, the person I sat next to in a lecture asked if I wanted to join them for a grocery trip. That question probably changed the entire course of my student life here.
Amazing, isn't it? How such a simple, everyday invitation could feel so transformative.
It really underscores how these small interactions create stability, psychological safety. They're not trivial at all.
No, they perform this essential social function, confirming your place, your existence within that community.
And this really challenges that purely individualistic view of well-being that Sarah White critiques. It shows how socially constructed it is.
Absolutely. And the flip side was also clear. When those small signs were absent
or withdrawn, yeah. Students talked about feeling invisible, peripheral.
That lack of feeling like they mattered. It didn't just affect belonging. It hit their motivation, their engagement with their studies, with university life generally.
We had that quote, I realized too late how important it was to find your group. I feel like I'm paying for it now, when everyone has their group and I'm left out. It shows the lasting impact.
Which leads quite naturally into the second theme, which was about the mechanisms of exclusion.
Yeah, and what was interesting here was that exclusion often wasn't, overt or intentional. It was more subtle.
Unfolding through everyday practices, social norms, things that just unintentionally marginalize some students.
And thinking about complexity theory again, those initial feelings of disconnection, they can create these reinforcing loops, snowball effects of isolation.
A concrete example that came up was around social rituals involving alcohol, especially during things like Welcome Week.
Right. One student said, "I learned not to skip drinking during the Welcome Week. I quickly realized that parties were happening without me being told."
It shows how these dominant cultural norms can act as real structural barriers for some students, even if that's not the intention.
And we saw this in the digital realm, too. The student who mentioned, "I was excluded and ignored. They had a Facebook group I wasn't part of."
Which might sound minor, but if that's where the group chats and study planning happens.
Exactly. It amplifies the social isolation, and it can even hinder academic collaboration. It's how these small exclusions accumulate.
And that quote,
We found vulnerability often clustered around transition points, starting university, changing courses, dealing with health crises.
and it's crucial here, isn't it, to see student distress not just as an individual failing.
Absolutely. Our findings really point to it being an interplay of personal factors, yes, but also structural issues and those relational dynamics we've been talking about.
Like the student who wrote, "I quit a program I had started. The whole process left me feeling alone and like a failure."
That really illustrates how institutional design, the processes themselves, can impact how students navigate personal challenges, sometimes making things worse.
And we also saw how past experiences of exclusion could linger, creating ongoing anxiety.
Making it harder to form new connections. That student who said, "I feel generally anxious at school, so I stay quiet." That means people don't really get to know me.
It shows the sort of shadow these experiences can cast.
And then there were the more structural vulnerabilities, things like serious illness, housing instability, financial strain.
These really challenge that purely individualistic view of well-being, showing its limits.
Definitely. This student who said, "I got seriously ill my first year and had surgery. Ideally, I would have taken fewer courses without financial worry." That highlights systemic pressure.
Or the one who described a domino effect of challenges leading to dropping out. You see the systemic forces at play.
But importantly, we also saw the power of supportive relational infrastructures.
Yes, the positive side. The student who talked about their shared house, the collective, being crucial. We cook Sunday dinners together and support each other in crisis.
A fantastic example of that idea of being well together, how community provides that vital support.
So, pulling all this together in the discussion, it seems really clear that student well-being isn't just some individual attribute.
No, it emerges from this complex mix. Social recognition, institutional structures, cultural norms on campus.
And using those theoretical lenses, relational well-being, mattering, complexity, you can really see the lasting psychological weight of these everyday relational moments.
When students feel seen, included, remembered, when they feel they matter, it fuels motivation, engagement, stability.
And the opposite is also true. When that recognition is missing, often subtly, systemically, it can really undermine a student's sense of self and belonging.
Creating those negative feedback loops of disconnection. And these aren't just interpersonal hiccups. They are embedded in the university's culture, its systems.
Which really calls for a fundamental shift, doesn't it, in how universities approach student support.
Yes. Institutions need to grapple with the cumulative impact of countless small interactions across the entire student experience.
Things that might seem minor individually can collectively lead to significant marginalization if they aren't tackled structurally and culturally.
So genuine support has to go beyond reactive services, like just offering counseling.
It needs to be about proactively building inclusion as the norm, embedding it.
Which challenges those deficit models that put all the onus on the individual student's resilience.
Instead, our findings point towards well-being as a shared responsibility, something co-produced.
Fostered by environments that actively nurture fairness, participation, connection. That idea of being well together requires institutional attention to inequality.
And a relational ethic that values students as whole people within these dynamic social systems.
So just to wrap up, this study aimed to examine student well-being and belonging through their own narratives of everyday relational life.
And the key takeaway is really that student well-being isn't created in a vacuum. It emerges right at the intersection of institutional design, cultural norms, and daily interactions.
Using that relational welfare lens, we saw the profound impact of recognition, the subtle ways exclusion operates, and the different layers of vulnerability students navigate.
It strongly argues for moving beyond individual responsibility towards a systemic view, one grounded in fairness, recognition, and shared responsibility.
We need to think about cultivating, perhaps, well-being ecosystems within universities.
Environments designed to foster participation, dignity, and care. Understanding universities as places where belonging is co-created.
Which requires rethinking well-being beyond individual adaptation, focusing instead on culture, relationships, everyday practices.
Ultimately, efforts to support student well-being must be embedded right across teaching, student support, campus life, making relational well-being a tangible shared goal.